In the late summer of 1683, Europe stood on the edge of a precipice. The continent that had survived plagues, internal conflicts, and centuries of shifting power now faced a danger unlike anything it had seen before. Imagine the skies above Vienna heavy with smoke, a thick gray veil drifting over rooftops blocking the afternoon sunday. From the hills surrounding the besieged city, the steady rhythm of war drums echoed like a heartbeat in the distance, each beat coming from tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers preparing for the final push. Vienna, the gateway to Central Europe, trembled beneath the weight of an approaching storm, and in the middle of this overwhelming darkness came a single impossible question. How could 3,000 cavalrymen, even elite ones, change the course of a battle already leaning toward disaster? How could a small force outnumbered, outmatched, and arriving at what seemed like the last possible moment pull an entire continent back from the brink? To understand why this moment mattered, we must step into the reality of 1683. The Ottoman Empire was one of the most powerful forces on Earth. For centuries, it expanded steadily across the Middle East, North Africa, and southeastern Europe. Its armies were vast, disciplined, and feared. Its leaders had set their sights on Vienna not just as a conquest, but as a symbol, the door to Central Europe. If Vienna fell, nothing stood between the Ottoman forces and the heartlands beyond. By the time the siege began, Vienna had already endured 2 brutal months of constant pressure. Supplies ran dangerously low. Families rationed bread to crumbs. Water had to be guarded carefully. Exhaustion settled over the city like a shadow. The defenders fought bravely, but they were stretched thin, weighing every arrow, every piece of ammunition, every decision. The morale of the citizens and soldiers weakened day by day as they watched more and more Ottoman tents spread across the countryside, turning fields and meadows into a sea of white canvas and banners. More than 150,000 Ottoman soldiers surrounded the city, a number so overwhelming that the walls of Vienna looked almost fragile in comparison. The citizens could hear the digging of tunnels beneath their feet as Ottoman sappers worked day and night to collapse parts of the walls. Every sunrise brought new fear. Every sunset brought the dread of another night of bombardments. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold, the first unable to defend Vienna with the limited forces he had, was forced to abandon the capital and seek help. He left behind a city that could only survive if allies came quickly. The responsibility for answering that desperate plea fell on one nation, Poland, and the man who carried that responsibility was King Jan III Sobieski. Sobieski understood the stakes immediately. He knew that if Vienna fell, the balance of power in Europe would shift forever. He acted swiftly, reaching out to form a united force, with the states threatened by the Ottoman advance. This was not a simple diplomatic gesture. It was an act of courage, of leadership, and of belief that Europe still had a chance. Step by step, through meetings, letters, and tense negotiations, an alliance began to take shape. Soldiers from different regions, speaking different languages, driven by different loyalties, agreed to fight side by side. They understood that this was not just another conflict. It was a turning point, a moment in which their decisions would write the next chapter of European history. And riding at the heart of this alliance, answering Vienna's cry for help, was a force unlike any other in Europe, the Winged Hussars. Their story was just beginning. And at the center of this growing alliance, rising like a force carved out of legend, came the warriors who would soon change everything, the Winged Hussars. They were not just another cavalry unit. They were the result of generations of evolution, refinement, and a culture shaped by constant threats on every border. Their origins reached back to the late 15th century, when Poland and its neighbors relied on fast, maneuverable cavalry to counter enemies who attacked with speed and unpredictability. Over time, this cavalry did not just improve, it transformed. It became heavier, stronger, more disciplined, and far more formidable. Eventually, it earned a name that Europe would never forget. They were called the Winged Hussars because of the great wooden frames rising behind their backs, attached to saddles or armor lined with rows of feathers. These were not decorative ornaments. They were symbols of identity, courage, and unity. When sunlight touched these wings, the feathers shimmered. When the hussars moved, the wings shifted like a living extension of the rider. and when they charged at full speed, the wind rushed through the feathers, creating a low, eerie sound that carried across the battlefield. Many enemies described it as the sound of something supernatural, as if the air itself had begun to whisper a warning. Their armor reflected the strength of the unit. Highly polished metal plates wrapped around their chests and shoulders, shaped to allow both mobility and protection. Their helmets were crafted with elegant curves, fitted with nose guards, and sometimes small decorative crests. Each hussar carried a long lance, often reaching over 15 feet, designed to strike with tremendous force at the moment of impact. Once the lance broke, the hussar drew his saber or pistol, continuing the fight with relentless determination. Their horses were carefully selected and trained, powerful enough to carry armor at high speed, yet agile enough to turn sharply in the chaos of battle. But what truly set them apart was their strategy. The Winged Hussars perfected the art of the shock charge, a sudden, overwhelming strike meant to break an enemy formation before a prolonged fight could even begin. They trained to maintain perfect alignment while accelerating downhill, gaining speed until their approach felt like the rumble of a coming storm. When 3,000 of them charged together, the combination of speed, weight, discipline, and raw power created an impact that few armies in Europe could withstand. That sound of the wings was more than a legend. As the hussars gained momentum, the rushing air vibrating through the feathers produced a faint but unmistakable hum. Soldiers facing them often described a rising sense of dread as the sound grew louder. The sight of those wings, the shaking earth beneath thousands of hooves, the unwavering line of lances, all of it struck fear long before the physical collision arrived. Yet technique and equipment were only part of their strength. What truly carried the hussars was their spirit. These were men who had grown up with the understanding that their homeland was shaped by conflict. They trained their entire lives for moments when everything depended on their resolve. As they prepared to ride toward Vienna, they knew the responsibility they carried. Every rider understood that the fate of Europe might rest in their hands, and instead of fear, that knowledge hardened their determination. Their journey to Vienna was not simple. They had to cross mountains, forests, and rough terrain. The final stretch brought them through the thick woods and steep slopes of the Kahlenberg Ridge. Horses struggled for footing. Cold winds swept across the hillside. The men could see smoke in the distance, not the smoke of cooking fires or hearths, but the heavy, dark smoke of a city under siege. And when they finally reached the ridge and looked down, they saw Vienna in distress, surrounded by a sea of tents and banners. Without needing a single spoken command, the hussars knew why they had come and what they had to do next. As the Winged Hussars looked down from the ridge, the morning of September 12, 1683, began to unfold with a mixture of tension and destiny. Dawn broke slowly over the hills surrounding Vienna, casting long streaks of pale gold across the valley. The cool morning air carried both hope and dread, mixing the smell of damp earth with the distant smoke rising from the besieged city. Below, the enormous Ottoman encampment stretched endlessly across the fields like a restless ocean of tents, banners, and soldiers preparing for another day of battle. By first light, the Allied European forces began to move. Positioned along the slopes of the Kahlenberg, thousands of troops from Poland, Bavaria, Saxony, and the Holy Roman Empire advanced down the mountainside. They navigated through thick brush, uneven rocks, and narrow paths, each step crunching quietly beneath their boots. The air vibrated with tension. Every man understood that what happened today would echo far beyond Vienna. As the soldiers descended, the sounds of battle slowly awakened. Metal clattered, commands echoed. The distant pounding of Ottoman drums returned, steady and unnervingly calm, as if the empire itself believed victory was inevitable. Yet the atmosphere among the European troops was the opposite. There was anxiety, yes, but also resolve. The morning chill sharpened their senses. They had marched for days. They had seen the smoke. And now, for the first time, the full scale of the Ottoman siege came into view. The Ottoman defenders responded quickly. Though their army was vast, months of siege had stretched them thin. Units were scattered across trenches, siege lines, tunnels, and artillery positions. Some soldiers rushed into formation with practiced discipline. Others moved with visible exhaustion. Many had spent night after night digging, guarding, or preparing for an assault that never came. Fatigue had settled deeply into the camp like a heavy fog. Inside the Ottoman lines, frustration brewed. Their commanders had expected Vienna to fall long before now. The defenders inside the city had held out longer than anticipated. Supplies in the Ottoman camp were not limitless. Tempers ran short. Confidence, once unshakable, had been chipped away by delays and losses. And although they saw the Allied armies descending the ridge, many underestimated the threat, assuming the newcomers were simply another force to be pushed back. But the European advance grew stronger by the hour. Skirmishes broke out along the hillside. Plumes of dust rose as cavalry and infantry clashed. Cannons thundered across the valley, sending echoes rolling like distant thunder. The tension built, steadily preparing the stage for something decisive, something the Ottomans did not expect. Near the summit, King Jan III Sobieski gathered his commanders. They formed a tight circle around him, their faces lit by the rising Sunday. Each man understood the scale of the moment. The battle had begun well, but the Ottoman lines were deep. Their positions were fortified. Their numbers were still immense. Some commanders voiced concerns. They feared that a premature strike could exhaust the alliance too early. Others warned that the enemy still had reserves hidden beyond the tents. Sobieski listened carefully, his expression firm but calm. He knew the risks better than anyone. He had spent days studying the battlefield, riding along the ridge, observing troop movements and terrain. And now, with the fighting intensifying below, he saw an opportunity forming. The Ottomans were stretched. Their formations were unstable. Their attention was divided across miles of siege works. The mountainside attack was forcing them to shift troops rapidly. Sobieski looked toward the valley, the city walls, the swirling smoke. Then he spoke with unwavering certainty. "We must prepare the cavalry," he said. The words were steady, decisive, carrying the weight of a leader who understood exactly what had to be done. The council fell silent. Every commander there felt a chill of anticipation. They knew what Sobieski was preparing, the largest cavalry assault Europe had ever seen. And as they stepped away to carry out his order, an unspoken understanding passed through the ranks. The moment of decision was coming. Everything would depend on the next charge. And as the tension on the battlefield reached its breaking point, the moment that Jan III Sobieski had been waiting for finally arrived. By late afternoon, as the shadows stretched long across the valley, the sun dipped toward the horizon. The clock approached 5 in the evening, the hour that would be remembered for centuries. At that moment, a breeze swept across the Kahlenberg Ridge, carrying dust, smoke, and the weight of history. Below, the battlefield churned with chaos. Cannon fire cracked through the air, muskets thundered, voices rose and fell in a swirl of confusion. Yet on the ridge above it all, the world suddenly felt still, as if time paused to witness what was about to unfold. Sobieski raised his arm. Officers galloped down the lines, repeating the order that every man had been waiting for. Standards unfurled. The red and white Polish banners fluttered in the wind, reflecting the last golden light of the day. Rows of winged hussars lowered their long lances. Feathers rising from their wings shook gently, whispering as the wind slid between them. The riders leaned forward in their saddles. The ground beneath them rumbled as horses shifted into position, and then the hooves began to move. At first, it was only a slow walk, a rhythmic, heavy beat. Then came a trot, steady and controlled. The sound grew deeper, more powerful, rolling across the ridge like distant thunder. The wings shimmered behind the riders, their white feathers trembling as the pace increased. Sobieski's voice rose above the wind. Forward, the trot became a canter. Armor clattered. Lances pointed ahead like a forest of steel. 18,000 cavalrymen with 3,000 winged hussars at the very front descended the slope as one unstoppable force. Their speed grew with every stride. Earth flew behind them. The wings hissed through the air, creating a chilling vibration that carried across the valley. Ottoman soldiers who heard it later described the sensation as a wave of fear rolling toward them long before the riders came into sight. And then came the charge. The hussars burst from the hillside, no longer silent, no longer distant, but thundering, roaring, a storm of men and horses driving straight toward the heart of the Ottoman line. The rhythm shifted from fast to furious. Every heartbeat seemed to merge with the pounding hooves. The riders did not hesitate. They did not falter. Their determination radiated from the very ground. For those facing them, the sight was overwhelming. Dust swirled. Light flashed from armor and lances. The enormous formation of cavalry seemed to stretch endlessly, filling the valley like a rising tide. Ottoman soldiers scrambled to form ranks, but the months of siege had drained them. Their lines, stretched thin and already under pressure from the fighting earlier in the day, buckled almost immediately. The impact was explosive. Lances shattered on shields and armor. Horses crashed through defensive lines. The momentum alone sent men scattering. The Ottoman formation rippled, then broke. Panic spread faster than orders could be shouted. In moments, units that had held strong for weeks suddenly collapsed under the shock of the charge. The sound of retreat began to rise, shouts, footsteps, confusion. What had started as resistance quickly turned into disorder. Behind the hussars, the rest of the Allied cavalry surged forward, widening the breach. Infantry pressed in. The Ottoman army, overwhelmed and unable to reform, began to pull back from the siege lines. Tents collapsed. Supplies were abandoned. The siege, the months-long pressure that had nearly crushed Vienna, unraveled in a matter of minutes. As the Ottoman lines retreated, Sobieski led his riders straight toward the city gates. Dust and smoke rose behind him as the cavalry cut through the remnants of the enemy positions. When the gates finally opened, the people of Vienna surged forward. Soldiers embraced allies they had never met. Citizens wept with relief. Cheers echoed across the ruined streets. Sobieski dismounted and looked over the city, battered, exhausted but standing. The impossible had happened. Vienna was saved. And as the echoes of the great charge faded across the valley, the truth of what had happened settled over the battlefield like a dawn after a long storm. The impossible had been made real. The lines that had once seemed unbreakable were shattered. In the Ottoman army, the force that had held Vienna in its grip for months was now in full retreat. Smoke drifted across the plain as the sun lowered behind the hills, casting the battlefield in soft gold. The Ottoman soldiers, overwhelmed by the shock of the cavalry assault and unable to regroup, pulled back in disorder. Tents were abandoned. Supplies were left scattered across the fields. What had been an enormous, confident encampment now dissolved into a hurried withdrawal. For Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, the defeat was undeniable. His grand campaign, planned for months and fueled by ambition, ended in failure. He had come to Vienna expecting a swift victory, expecting the city to fall and the road into Central Europe to open. Instead, he saw his army break beneath the hooves of the Winged Hussars and the united forces of Europe. The siege was over. Vienna stood tall again, battered, exhausted, but victorious. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the people of Vienna welcomed King Jan III Sobieski and his riders into the city with tears, cheers, and overwhelming relief. Soldiers who had fought on the walls embraced the cavalrymen who had saved them. Families clung to one another, grateful to see another day. The city that had braced for destruction now pulsed with gratitude and awe. This victory did more than end a siege. It reshaped the course of European history. The Battle of Vienna marked the turning point that halted the expansion of the Ottoman Empire into Central Europe. What could have been the opening of a new era of conquest instead became the moment the empire's advance was firmly pushed back. The balance of power shifted. Europe's future politically, culturally, spiritually held a different path because of what happened that day. For Poland, the victory solidified its place in history as a nation capable of heroic action when the stakes were at their highest. The sight of the Winged Hussars leading the charge became more than a military maneuver. It became a symbol, a reminder of courage, unity, and the extraordinary strength that can come from standing together. The Hussars themselves entered legend. Their wings, once a practical part of battlefield identity, transformed into a timeless emblem of bravery. Their charge became one of the most celebrated cavalry assaults in world history, a moment scholars, soldiers, and storytellers would revisit for generations. But beyond the strategy and the symbolism lies something deeper, something human. When we look back at that moment, we are reminded of how fragile history truly is. Had the Allied forces arrived a day later, had the plans faltered, had the charge hesitated for even a moment, Europe might have taken a very different shape. Vienna might have fallen. The ripple effects would have touched countless lives, cultures, and nations across centuries. Instead, unity prevailed, determination prevailed, courage prevailed. The story of the Winged Hussars teaches us that even in the darkest moments, a single act of bravery can shift the course of the world. It reminds us that cooperation between nations can overcome overwhelming odds. And it shows that the human spirit, when driven by conviction and purpose, can achieve what seems impossible. As we close this chapter, I invite you to reflect on the moment that moved you most in this incredible story. Was it the sight of the cavalry gathering on the ridge, the thunder of the charge, the relief of Vienna's people as their gates opened to their saviors? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective adds a new voice to this living history. And if you enjoyed this journey into the past, consider subscribing to the channel. There are countless more stories, powerful, emotional, and unforgettable, waiting to be told. Together we can continue exploring the events that shaped our world.